There's Something Terribly Wrong with My Son by Christopher Maxim. There's something terribly wrong with my son. He's only 4 months old, but I can still tell that he isn't acting like himself. He used to laugh whenever I made funny faces, but now he just stares at me. He stares at me with a blank yet strange expression. He used to cry at night, just like a normal infant, but now he just lies there looking at the ceiling from the comfort of his crib. It's downright weird. I'm not even sure if he's sleeping anymore. Every time I get up in the middle of the night to check on him, he's just lying there with that same facial expression, staring at nothing. He stares at nothing, that is, until I enter the room. Then he turns his attention to me. I don't like it. I truly don't. I decided to take the little guy to the doctor's office shortly after this string of occurrences began. As unsettling as the ordeal seemed, I was more concerned than anything else. This was my only child, after all, and being a single parent tends to leave little room for me to do much else but worry. Sometimes I wish I had someone to share the burden with. For now, it's just me and him. Upon arriving at the doctor's office, I noticed that there were others in the waiting room. A mother, her son, and their service dog. I'm fairly certain the mother was deaf. The boy looked to be about 3 years of age. He looked over at us and smiled, but his amused demeanor was abruptly replaced with what appeared to be a look of terror. He scrambled over to his mom's leg and hid behind it. This is when the dog looked over at us and began barking wildly. It was the weirdest thing. The mother managed to calm both her son and dog down, and the 3 of them took their turn with Dr. Harrison. They eventually left, leaving only my son and me. We continued to wait while Dr. Harrison prepared for our appointment. The time that then passed must have amounted to only a few mere minutes, but it felt like a hell of a lot longer. I could see my son staring at me out of the corner of my field of vision. I could feel his eyes piercing through mine, even though I refused to look back at him. I can't explain it, but an odd sense of anxiety began growing within me. Luckily, Dr. Harrison came out and saved me from my private anguish. It sounds awful, but I could not bear to be alone with my son any longer. I spoke with Dr. Harrison and explained everything that had been going on, being careful not to tell him about what had just happened in the waiting room. I didn't want him thinking I was crazy. He performed the usual tests on my son and told me that he was a perfectly normal and healthy baby. He even told me that I was lucky that he was so calm at this age. Lucky? Really? I could not wrap my head around this. No, I wasn't, and no, my son was not normal. Normal babies don't act this way. They just don't. I could have ignored the situation and chalked it up to an odd phase that he was going through, one that would hopefully pass in the coming months. But not only did it not pass, it also became much, much worse. I tucked my son into his crib just a few nights ago and tried my best to ignore the blank glance that he threw my way. I turned off the light and went to bed. This was my normal routine. At roughly 3 in the morning, I woke up. I don't know why I woke up at such an odd time. I usually sleep through the night like a baby, for lack of a less ironic phrase. I am, however, glad that I woke up when I did, due to what I found upon waking. Well, glad in a sense. There on all fours, crawling about on my bed, was none other than my son. How was that even possible? I quickly looked over at the crib. It was just how I left it. There was no way he could have crawled out of there at his age. He surely would have hit the floor with a loud thud and injured himself. So how exactly did he get from his crib to my bed? How? I put my son back in his crib and tried to go back to sleep. I found this task to be nearly impossible, as I couldn't get the image of my son out of my head. While he was crawling on my bed, he was crawling towards me. Not only this, but he still had that blank expression on his face, staring at me as he crawled, his eyes never wavering. He didn't blink, not even once. Why was he crawling in my direction? What would he do when he finally reached me? The questions that filled my frightened brain were too much for me to simply go back to sleep. I stayed up for the rest of the night and spent most of it staring at my son's crib. Eventually, my weariness did catch up with me. Shortly after the sun came up over the horizon, I passed out. It must have been a good hour before I woke up again. After rubbing my eyes a few times and looking over at the crib, I realized something. My son was not in it. I jumped up quickly and investigated. I tossed his blankets around, only to find that it really was empty. He was gone. I looked over at my bed, but he was not there either. I turned my apartment upside down looking for him. I checked every room, every little nook and cranny I could possibly find. While doing this, there was quite a large knot in the pit of my stomach. I could neither tell if I was worried for my son's safety or if I was just plain scared. Perhaps it was a bit of both. I finished scouring my apartment and went back to my room to catch my breath. What I saw nearly took it away again. There, lying in his crib, was my son, as calm as could be. I walked over to the crib and just stared at him. He, of course, stared back with that unnerving expression of his. I realized then that I was truly frightened of an infant. I looked at him for a few more moments before speaking. "What are you?" His eyes widened upon hearing me speak. I cannot be certain, but I think that maybe, for just a split second, my son might have grinned at me. It has been almost a week since my son crawled up onto my bed somehow. Since then, I have set up a video camera in the room just to see what it might catch. The camera makes me feel safer than I did before. I know it sounds ridiculous, but I think it is the camera that's keeping him from doing anything else. Either way, at least I managed to get a little bit of sleep at night now that it's there. The camera is of a very decent quality. It has night vision, HD audio capture, everything I need to watch over the actions of my son at night. If he even so much as moves a limb, I will see and hear it. I finally had a way to combat my woes, but setting up this expensive piece of equipment did make me feel foolish. It's one thing to monitor your child for their own safety, but I was in fact spying on my son to see if he was up to something. It wasn't for his safety. It was for mine. It sounds crazy, I know, but what happened next did confirm my suspicions, if only to a small extent. Until last night, the footage was completely normal. My son slept through the night as I tossed and turned. I think that perhaps he was pretending to sleep for the camera's sake. The second night of recording, however, was a bit strange. The first few hours were normal, much like the night before, but that is when my son did something surprising. Using his tiny, undeveloped arms and legs, he stood up in his crib, using the bars to lean on. He adjusted himself to face the camera and stared at it. He stared for a solid 12.5 minutes with that horribly unsettling, blank expression of his before lying back down. The part that really gets me is about halfway through the clip where he actually lets go of the bars and is standing up on his own for a few moments. This, to me, was utterly inexplicable. I was shocked. A plethora of theories bombarded my mind at an alarming rate, from the mundane to the sinister. Maybe he was just advanced for his age, having the ability to not only stand up straight, but also escape the confines of his crib and crawl up onto my bed like he'd done almost a week previously. I quickly discarded this thought, deeming it nearly impossible. Perhaps he isn't my son at all. Maybe he is something else entirely. Not even a he, but an it. I discarded this theory as well, not wanting to give in to any notions of the supernatural. It just wasn't logical. I knew I would have to speak with Dr. Harrison again to potentially put my weary mind at ease. I had already made an appointment to see Dr. Harrison again later in the week, but after seeing this footage, I had him squeeze me in early. I made my way to his office once again, son and all, and patiently sat in the waiting room. I paid no attention to my son's blank stare like before, but it still made me feel uneasy. As we waited, his stare became increasingly more difficult to ignore. For whatever reason, I felt compelled to look back at him, even though I knew it would make me anxious to do so. Even so, I turned my head downwards and stared at him. His eyes. There was something wrong with his eyes. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but there was something terribly off about them. They were the same eyes. They still seemed different. I don't quite know how to explain it. Luckily, Dr. Harrison came out of hiding, putting an end to our nerve-wracking staring match. What a relief. I don't know why, but I feel like I would have just kept staring at my son seemingly to no end. Rather than dwelling on my inner fearful inclinations, I focused on the task at hand. Skipping the seemingly normal parts of the video, I showed Dr. Harrison the odd occurrence from the second night. He watched in awe as my 4-month-old son stood up on his own and faced the camera. Becoming impatient, I asked for his thoughts on it. You know what he had to say? He actually congratulated me on having such a well-developed child. He said that my son was advanced for his age and that he was glad to have helped him along in the process, as if he had anything to do with it. Telling him about the night he crawled onto my bed heeded no results either. It only added to his already oversaturated ego. I was absolutely flabbergasted by his reaction. In any case, I did manage to get the receptionist to refer me to a specialist in infant behavior on my way out. I desperately needed someone to talk to that wasn't completely oblivious to the matter. I went home both angry at Dr. Harrison and exhausted from the ordeal mentally as well as physically. I put my son in his crib, being careful not to look at his eyes again as much as I felt the need to. I then went out to the living room and sat down on the couch in an attempt to unwind. I shut my eyes for but a moment and quickly fell asleep. I dreamt. In my dream, I was sitting on the couch just like I was before falling asleep. I tried getting up, but my legs and arms felt very heavy and sluggish. I gave in to the situation and just sat there. I took a look around and noticed that the room looked a little bit different. The frames I had put up on the wall containing pictures of my wife and son were now empty. It was then that I began to feel dizzy as a strange knot grew in my stomach. I felt a need to look over to my left towards the bedroom. There, standing up on his own, was my son. He was at the doorway to the bedroom, just staring at me. Before I could even privately react, he began walking. In an awkward slush of movement, my son walked towards me. His stride was grotesque and unnatural, causing the knot in my stomach to grow larger. He continued to walk until finally reaching a spot just a few inches from where I was sitting. He reached his hand out towards me as I watched in horror. What was he going to do? Why was this happening? Why? I woke up before my son's hand could reach me. I jumped up in fear, still half asleep, and ran into the bedroom. I rushed over to the crib, and a wave of relief overcame me. He was still in there, staring blankly up at me, like he always did. Thank goodness. I walked back over to the couch and sat down to collect my thoughts. It seems that even in my sleep, I'm not safe. This mess that I found myself in is causing me not only a great deal of stress, but also to have nightmares. I need it to end. I will be giving the specialist a call shortly to set up an appointment. In the meantime, it's back to square one, trying to get some shut-eye while recording the actions of my son in the hopes of finding some answers. It seems that this is what our little family has come to. We now lie at the cross-section of strange and completely mad. I, for one, just want everything to be over and done with, so I can finally get a good night's rest. To be continued. Special thanks to Christopher Maxim for writing and allowing me to read this story. You can find more from Christopher linked in the description below. And of course, if you'd like more dark content from me, be sure to subscribe to my channel now, because you won't want to miss what's next. Also, be sure to keep those lights off and watch my last episode of Anatomy of Murder. This episode covers the devastating story of James Hubbardy, a man who committed a massacre in a McDonald's in 1984. You can either press on screen now to watch it or go into the description below, and there is a link down there for you. And I will see you next Monday.